Nobody yet. I was waiting. That one sunrise in Rome, it seemed like one more, with its dense clouds and the bustle content of the city of the Vatican. But inside a discreet room, the A-man who had guided millions for years was preparing for his final journey. Pope Francis, already very weakened, he had asked for silence, but not as a denial, but as a prelude to something important. They were surrounded by doctors, cardinals, and trusted people. However, their eyes were not looking for comfort, neither attention. They were fixed in a worn leather folder, which he had kept since his priestly youth. In she was sleeping a message that had been disturbing for decades. The Third Secret of Fatima. Its decision was taken. I would not allow her to leave this world without finally opening what many they had preferred to keep it buried under layers of fear and ecclesiastical diplomacy. Francis was not a man of empty gestures. From the beginning of his pontificate, he had opted for the simplicity, for the closeness with the last, by a faith that walks with barefoot through the human peripheries. That's why, when announced that he would speak of the third secret, don't made from the central balcony, nor in a solemn letter, said in a low voice in a small room, with the serenity of one who carries a cross much bigger than his body. His voice trembled as he began, not from fear, but from reverence. Don't be afraid of the content, he said. Be afraid to ignore it. Then he began to relate not what many they expected, no catastrophes, no apocalyptic beasts, no fires of the sky, but something infinitely closer and therefore same, more terrifying, the slow disappearance of the faith. The real secret was an inner wound, a fire that started inside the own church. For decades, rumors about the content of the third secret had multiplied. Some, they said that he predicted the end of the world. Others, they were talking about a nuclear war or an internal betrayal in the Vatican. But what Francis shared was not an external warning, but a painfully intimate revelation. The true danger did not come from outside, but from within. The vision that Sister Lucia had recorded showed a pope walking among ruins, weeping, praying, until he was struck down by a shower of arrows and bullets. Many interpreted it as a physical attack. Francis, on the other hand, understood as a metaphor for the spiritual decay. The fallen pope was a symbol of a church wounded from within, torn apart by the loss of his essence, by empty routine, by lukewarmness disguised as prudence. In a calm voice, he recounted how for years had felt that weight, that growing void when the structures remain, but the soul fades away. He said he had seen with sadness how his gospel was transformed in slogan, how the liturgy was filled with words but lost his fire. He spoke of a silent apostasy, not of atheists aggressive, neither external persecutions, but from Christians who no longer believed, who attended Mass without faith, which they preached without love. We don't need an earthquake to fall, he said. It is enough get used to living without God. In that moment, the room was in absolute silence. Some cardinals, they came down the look, others they cried silently. It was not a scandal. What was being revealed was a plea, a last attempt by a pastor to awaken his flock before the final dusk. If any of this touches your soul, maybe it's time to share it with who also needs to wake up. Francis explained that the message from the Virgin in Fatima, it had not been a threat but a desperate act of love. Mary, he said, did not come to announce a punishment but to plead for conversion. She did not ask public miracles nor grandiose constructions, he recalled. He asked his rosary diary, small sacrifices for sinners, and the consecration to the Immaculate Heart. They were humble gestures, almost invisible, but charged with spiritual power. In the vision, the Pope was passing through a city destroyed, praying for the dead, for the living, for those who had not yet born. It was not a prophecy of the future, but a mirror of the present. A church walking among the rubble of his own incoherence, and that the rain of missiles, according to Francis, represented every omission, every silent scandal, every time the true was changed for convenience. That day, while spoke, His face did not show fear. It was that of a man who had accepted his time, but it was not ready to leave without first leaving a light on. "It is not more serious that there is sin in the world," he said firmly. "It more serious is that there is resignation within the church." He said that for years I had seen how they avoided each other certain topics, how uncomfortable truths were silenced in name of diplomacy. But, according to he had arrived the time to speak with clarity. "We don't have right to bury what he, darling, has revealed. We are not owners of the message." Upon hearing that, many they understood that what was happening was not a revelation new, but a delivery. Francis was returning a message to your origin, to the faithful people, so that no one else could manipulate it, so that in the end it would become in what always it should have been, a call to spiritual awakening. After that statement, there were no official announcements, neither press conferences. Francis had asked that his words not be made up, neither translated in diplomatic language. I wanted them to be understood as they were sayings, raw, true, necessary. He retired to his room, where he spent long hours in silence, surrounded by images of saints and letters written by children who always kept in his desk. There, he read again the testimonies of the little shepherds of Fatima, especially that of Lucia, whose voice resonated still as an echo of the eternal. "Salvation will come through of the Immaculate Heart of Mary," he repeated over and over in a low voice, not as a motto but as a certainty. For him, that phrase was not decorative devotion, it was spiritual strategy. If evil advances through the coldness of the hearts, the answer can only be the tenderness of a consecrated heart. The days following were on hold. Health of the Pope worsened visibly, but he did not ask for more care or treatments. "I only requested that they will let you pray." In his bed, with hands clinging to a wooden rosary, her lips, they repeated a constant prayer for the lukewarm priests, for the families divided by the youths without course. He didn't blame the world. What most did hurt was the indifference within the church. "One faith without ardor, it is like an altar without fire," he said to one of the assistants who accompanied in the early morning. And then he added, "I don't fear those who hate us. I fear those who no longer believe, but are still inside." That phrase, spoken with a deep sigh, was scored by a young Monsignor who, without knowing it, would end becoming a privileged witness of the last hours of a pope who chose to leave saying the true. The Monsignor who accompanied, a young Argentine priest named Matteo, had been his student in Buenos Aires and stayed by his side at his request expresses of the Francis himself. In one of those nights of silence interrupted only by the Pope's labored breathing, Matteo asked if he didn't have afraid of having revealed something that many they preferred leave buried. Francis smiled with sweetness. "Afraid? No, son. I would be fear die, knowing that I didn't do it what I should have done." And then he added, "The gospel was not written to please the powerful. It was written to disturb the sleeping." Matthew remained silently, processing those words. I knew that what I had just heard was not just a reflection, but a spiritual legacy, a torch that must be carried further from the end. Up to date next, the Pope asked him to, they brought a leaf in white. His handwriting, though trembling, slowly drew a phrase that Matteo would remember for the rest of his life. "The time of the signs, it's over. Now, it's time for decision." Then saved the paper between the pages of your old breviary. I wasn't looking for leave formal wills, neither new documents. Your testimony was in his life, in his gestures, in his choice to tell what had been kept hidden for so long. Francis did not believe that the true out dangerous. I thought that the comfortable lie was much worse, and that's why, even knowing that his words would provoke discomfort within the Vatican walls, he chose path narrow, not out of rebellion, but out of fidelity. He knew that a church that remains silent in the face of lukewarmness loses its salt, and without salt, He said faith becomes in ritual without power, in structure soulless. Rumors quickly began to circulate within the Vatican. Some prelates murmured in the corridors on the audacity of the Pope. Others, they feared the media repercussions. But Francis was not looking for scandal. No headlines. His intention was pastoral, deeply human. He did not speak from the authority of a position, but from the vulnerability of a heart that was there cried for the church. In a conversation with a nun who visited him, he confessed, "I am not worried about how I will be remembered. I'm worried that they won't remember what I came to." For him, the true. I had to free itself from all diplomatic wrapping. It was a time to speak clearly without filters, because if the world was falling apart due to lack of faith, mission of the church could not be entertained dormant consciences, but awaken them with urgency. In his room, kept a small, unadorned wooden cross. He placed it before his eyes every morning upon waking. "Here, my day begins," he said. That cross was his anchor, its center. I didn't believe in a faith that lived only in documents, nor in a church that cared more for its image than his soul. Therefore, when speaking of the Third Secret, did not seek drama. His tone was almost intimate, like that of a grandfather who transmits a truth to his grandson before leaving. He said that he had played the vision of Fatima as a spiritual X-ray, a church walking among ruins, not because of external persecutions, but because of having let the fire of the Spirit will go out. A community without spirit, he said, is like a body without blood. It moves a little, but he's dead inside. His words, they were not looking for impress. They were looking to touch, and they did. They succeeded, because they came from someone who no longer had anything to lose except the silence that hurt so much there was made. The news was not long in coming in leak. Although Francis had spoken in a small environment, the echo of his words crossed walls, borders, and languages. Some media, they tried the revelation with sensationalism, focusing in which was not essential. But something different was happening between the faithful. There was a silent commotion, an awakening. In parishes from different countries began to organize vigils, prayer groups, rereadings of the message of Fatima, not out of fear, but out of conviction. For the first time in a long time, many believers, they felt that the church spoke with a naked heart that recognized its wounds, that did not hide his crisis, but the offered as part of the path of redemption. And that, paradoxically, generated hope. Matthew it noticed in the letters that arrived at the Vatican, in the emails, in the anonymous messages left in the goalkeeper. People from all over the world thanked the Pope for having saying what was feared for so long. "Thank you for trusting we," said a woman from Lisbon. "Thank you for not underestimating us," he wrote a young man from Manila. Francis did not respond to any, personally, but I read every line, and while it did, his eyes filled with tears. "Perhaps this was the miracle I was hoping for," he said one afternoon. "Not that the world would suddenly change, but that some hearts start burning again." For him, that was the true victory of the Immaculate Heart, not a spectacular heavenly intervention, but a silent conversion that begins in the intimate and spreads like fire in the dry forest of the indifference. Have you ever felt that fire to burn? Again, tell it in the comments. With he pass from the days, Francis faded like a flame that does not go out suddenly, but burns softer with a warmer light. Body was weakening, but his mind remained lucid. He asked readings simple, the Gospels, the diary of Saint Faustina, some letters from children. She rejected all formalities. She didn't want cameras nor tributes. "I only ask the silence of those who they know hear with the soul." In one of his last conversations with Matteo, "I trust that you do not I feared the death, but yes to the possibility that the church will forget why it exists." We weren't sent to manage, Matthew. We were sent to set the world on fire. That phrase, spoken with a broken voice, he remained recorded in the heart of the young priest, not as a nice metaphor, but as an urgent mission. One night, While the Pope was sleeping, Matthew sat down to write in his diary. I needed to record every detail, not to publish it. After, but not to forget, he noted how Francis prayed his rosary without interruption, how he murmured the names of some saints and common people who had scored. Maria de la Villa, 21. Juan, the shoeshine boy. Doña Angelica, from the dining room. He repeated. They were not public figures or official martyrs. They were the faces of Christ, hidden in the streets of Buenos Aires, where the then Jorge Mario Bergoglio had learned to see God in the flesh of the poor. For Matthew, that it revealed more than 1,000 theological discourses. It showed a soul that had been carved by the gospel lived, not just preached. And he understood that the third secret had not been revealed with words only. I was being incarnated in the way Francis chose to leave, without fear, without masks, with the heart exposed. In the last days of his life, Francis asked to be allowed to enter his room to ordinary people who worked within the Vatican, gardeners, cooks, guards, cleaning staff. One by one, they were passing and taking it the hand. To each one he said a word, a blessing, a gratitude. It was not a symbolic act. It was a way of telling them that they were church, that the holiness was not reserved for pulpits or conclaves. Thank you for watering the plants while they pray in silence, he said to the gardener. Thank you for taking care of the bread and the table, he said to the cook. A woman in charge of the laundry. Vili took his face and whispered, God sees every cloth you wipe. Each one is like a veil in the face of Christ. Those gestures, small but immense, became the last homilies of a pope who preached with the look. One afternoon, he asked me to bring an image of the Our Lady of Fatima, not a gold one, nor one from a glass case, a simple one, made of plaster, white, like the ones they have the humble families. He placed it next to his bed and, looking at it, whispered, Mother, I did what you asked me for. Now take me in peace. Matthew was present and felt a chill walk through the back. At that moment, he understood that there was nothing left allot time, but also understood that there was no sadness in those words, only surrender, only trust. Francis had not revealed a secret to cause a stir, but to remind everyone that the darling go on speaking, although many don't listen anymore. His farewell was not a scream, it was a whisper, and full of light. And in that whisper, every word had the weight of an eternity. When the doctor came in to check his vital signs, found him asleep. But it wasn't a dream, anyone. Francis had his rosary in her hands and a slight smile in her face. It seemed a child who had just heard a bedtime story. The doctor, it noticed in silence, without dare to interrupt the peace that filled the room. Minutes later, the Pope opened the eyes slowly. He searched with look at Matteo, and he said, Darwin, don't see me anymore. Don't look for answers in the papers. Search in the silence of the heart. There go on, God speaking. It was the last time he said something out loud. Then he closed his eyes again, eyes like someone who gives his soul without resistance, like someone who knows the journey can no longer wait. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's rang with a different cadence. It wasn't mourning, it was a sacred farewell. The news spread quickly. Pope Francis had departed. The whole world reacted, some with tears, others with admiration, others in silence. But inside the Vatican, the atmosphere was different. There was something sacred floating in the air, as if every corner remembered the last words of a man who chose the truth before the comfort. And in the following hours, they began to organize the funeral rites. But Matthew had a different mission. With trembling hands, he took a breviary of the Pope and found between its pages the handwritten paper. The time of the signs finished. Now it's time for decision. That sheet, without seal nor signature, was placed at the foot of the improvised altar next to the body of the Pope, not as an official document, but as a testimony. Because Francis did not leave a secret, he left a choice. And that choice, now, you belong to each one. The wake was simple, like him it had asked for. No exaggerated ornaments or pompous speeches, just a wooden cross. the image of the Virgin of Fatima, and a small sign read, "Pray, trust, walk." For hours, thousands of people passed by the body of the Pope, many in silence, others crying, some praying in low voices. Matteo, from a corner, he watched, not as a priest, but as a witness. He knew that the true farewell was not there in that public act, but in what would come after, the echo of his words, the seed planted in the hearts. And while looked he Francis' serene face, he understood something that the Pope had repeated so many times. The soul of the Church is not in Rome. It is in every heart that burns with love for Christ. In the days following, debates, articles, and controversies arose. Some criticized the revelation of the Third Secret, accusing her of being reckless. Others, they celebrated like a prophetic act. But beyond the opinions, something deeper was happening. In parishes small, in rural communities, in forgotten chapels, the faithful were beginning to gather. Again, the rosary. It was ringing again in families where he did years there was no prayer. Confession was transformed in meeting, and the message of Fatima, so many times filed away as a historical curiosity, recovered his strength as a living call. Matthew noticed with emotion contained, it was not a media phenomenon, it was something quieter, more intimate, more lasting. It was the faith awakening from the depths, just as Francis had desired, not with noise, but with fire. A week later, at the funeral, Matteo received an informal invitation to speak in a small parish in the southern Italy. It was not a conference, nor an official event, just a group of faithful who wanted to better understand what they were saying the Pope in his last days. He accepted, although with a certain fear. He didn't feel prepared. But when he arrived and saw the people sitting with rosaries in the hand and tears in the eyes, he understood that it was not about preparing a speech, but about opening the heart. He told what he had seen. He didn't embellish anything. He spoke of the wooden cross, of the simple visits, of the phrases Francis repeated with pain and hope. And in the end, an old woman approached. He took his hand and said, "Thank you for not letting the secret go back to sleep." That moment marked a before and a then for Matteo. From then on, he began to travel through different communities, sharing his testimony of what I experienced, not for fame or because of a commission from the Vatican, but out of fidelity. I felt that every word of the Pope had to find fertile ground, and that his mission was to help prepare that land. In each place, the reaction was similar: astonishment, silence, and then a blazing flame. Some youths, they began to pray rosary again. Others, they returned to Mass after years distant. And above all, many, they began to talk about their faith with sincerity, new, as if something dormant had awakened, as if, finally, the message that had been hidden for decades began to make what always wanted to do: convert hearts, not with fear, but with true. On one of those visits, Matteo was greeted by a group of young people who had organized a vigil nocturna with candles, prayer, and reading of the message of Fatima. When I saw it arrive, it surrounded with a mixture of respect and spiritual hunger. They didn't want selfies or quick blessings. They wanted to understand. One of them, he asked. Why? Think he went into hiding a message for so long? Matteo paused. He didn't want judge no one, but answered with sincerity. Because sometimes, when a truth hurts, we prefer to hide it. But the pain doesn't go away. It just rots. That phrase stuck floating in the air. It wasn't a criticism of previous popes, but a human observation. We all have afraid to say which is uncomfortable even within the church. But Francis had shown that silence out of fear can be more dangerous than speaking with love. The response of the youths was unexpected. Instead of being shocked, they organized. They began distributing copies of the original message of Fatima, accompanied by simple reflections on the faith, the repentance, and the conversion. They did it as activism, did as a mission. Some created online prayer channels. Others volunteered in homes and hospitals. The silent revolution, as Matteo began to call it, was growing without structures, without financing, without strategic plans, only with fire, a fire that was coming of the sky. But what did I need? Hearts ready to burn. And so, the secret that for so long had been buried under seals and fears was transformed in seed. A seed that I didn't need permission to bloom, only faith, only courage, only truth. Matteo was not looking for the limelight. In fact, he was uncomfortable when they presented him as the Pope's confidant. For him, he had been merely a witness, a bridge between what Francis experienced and what the world needed. Listen, I preferred talk about Jesus, about Mary, about the transformative power of prayer. But wherever he went, people asked him to tell more about the Pope's final hours. And then he spoke. He spoke of Francis's gaze as he held his rosary, from her whispers asking for the cold priests, of the emotion when mentioning the poor. And in each story, something moved in the hearts, as if his voice brought not only memories, but a command, not to let the faith to go out. Do not allow the fire becomes in ash. With he over time, communities emerged that began to be called sentinels of the heart. They had no statutes or visible leaders, just one motto: live as if the secret had already would have been revealed, because in his background, that was what Francis had said, that we should not expect new signs, that we did not need more apparitions, more mysteries. Essential already had been said in 1917, and now it was time to respond. The sentinels dedicated themselves to praying, to confessing, to accompanying the forgotten. Some even left everything to serve in land distant. They were not heroes. They were ordinary people who had understood that the biggest secret was not in the content of the message, but in the way we decide to live after meeting him. And that, Matthew thought every night, was the true legacy of Pope Francis. One day, Matteo received a letter with no return address. It simply said, "Thank you for allowing us to cry and believe again." Inside, there was a small, handmade cross carved in rustic wood. It had no signature, but the gesture spoke for itself. It was a silent confirmation that the message had not fallen on deaf ears. That cross became in his travel companion, not to show it off, but to remind yourself every day that the mission was not his, but God's, and that he, like Francis, was only a servant. That certainty released of the fear and of tiredness, because I knew that even though many would not understand, although others would mock, there was hearts willing. And where there is a heart willing, said Francis, start he miracle. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Vatican was facing a dilemma. Some sectors wanted to limit the circulation of the words of the Pope on the Third Secret. They feared that they would provoke divisions or misinterpretations, but others, especially young people, bishops and committed lay people, defended that the town had right to know, to discern, to respond. It was not a question of disclosing a document, but of lighting a flame. In a closed-door meeting, one of the cardinals closest to Francis said, "If he spoke, it was because the darling it allowed. Who are we to remain silent? What already was said?" That phrase, although spoken in a low voice, marked a turning point, because for the first time in a long time, the truth was not there being kept in a vault, but planted in the open field of the awareness Christian. The handmade cross that Matthew received that day, it began to pass from hand to hand. In every community he visited, someone you asked, hold it for a moment. Some they kissed, others they cried silently when touching it. It was not because of the wood in yes, but for what it represented, the faith simple, without embellishments, the same one that the Pope had lived until the last breath. Matthew noticed that the more he shared that cross, the more he understood what Francis had meant, that the secret was not needed guardians, but witnesses, that the message of Fatima was not a relic of the past, but a wound, open wound, that only heals with conversion. and that the time to wait for signs was over. Now it was the time to live, as if everything were already revealed. If you got this far, prove it was worth it. The penalty: save or share this history. On one of his trips to Latin America, Mateo was invited to speak in a prison. There, in front of men convicted of serious crimes, he shared the history of the Pope and the Third Secret. He did not use a theological language. He only spoke of the fire that goes out when we stop praying, of the soul that withers when we lose the hope. One of the prisoners, with tattoos in the arms and tears held back, raised his hand and asked, "Do you think that even I have time to come back?" Mateo did not hesitate. "You have time while you have breath," he replied, and in that moment the improvised chapel was filled with a silence that was not empty. It was reverence, because everyone, even the more broken, they felt that something sacred had been revealed, not by a distant pope, but by a God who continues calling, even from the mud. That meeting in the jail transformed something inside Mateo. He understood that the true mission was not to preserve the memory of the Pope, but to continue his dedication. He decided that he would not return to an office in Rome. Instead, he began to visit marginalized communities, hospitals, nursing homes, schools, rural. I didn't have itinerary fixed, nor institutional support, only a heart ready to serve. He carried 3 things with him: the Francis Breviary, the wooden cross, and a copy of the Fatima's original message. Wherever she went, she found someone in need. Listen, not a sad story, nor an apocalyptic prophecy, but a truth, simple, that the faith is fading, and that everyone can turn it on again, not with theories, with love, with prayer, with courage. In a mountainous region of Peru, was welcomed by an indigenous community that barely spoke Castilian, but when them speak of the heart of Mary, of the image of the Pope walking among ruins, and of the power of the rosary, the eyes lit up. An old woman sang a rosary made from seeds. He raised himself to heaven and said in his language, "God has not forgotten us." Matthew wept in silence, because he understood that this was the miracle that Francis had anticipated, not an act spectacular, but a multiplication of hearts on fire in the most forgotten corners of the world. The third secret was no longer a mystery sealed. It was a lived reality, a seed that at last I found fertile land where no one I expected. Mateo began to receive letters from people who had never there was known. Some, they were from mothers worried about the faith of their children. Others, of young people who wanted leave everything to consecrate himself. There was also who, simply, they wrote to tell that after listening the history of the Pope and the message of Fatima, they had prayed again. A woman from Senegal wrote, "I didn't understand everything he said, but I understood that God has not given up on me. Those words it accompanied in the days difficult, when tiredness and the incomprehension threatened by extinguishing his impulse. Francis, there was once said, that the true conversion makes no noise, but changes the course. And it I saw every day, in small gestures, in silent decisions, in souls that breathed faith again. On one of his brief returns to Rome, Matthew was invited to a private mass with some cardinals. In the end, one of them, old man with a reputation for being rigid, he was approached in silence. It took him arm with strength, and he said, "Thank you for not letting us forget it." Mateo didn't know what to answer, but when looking at the eyes of the cardinal, understood that even within the walls of ecclesiastical power, the message there was touched deep chords. Not because of the scandal, not because of the drama, but because, for the first time in a long time, someone had dared to speak of the soul. And that, he understood, is something that no one, not even the most prudent, can ignore forever. Because the soul, when listen the true, recognize his home. Do you feel that this story touched something in you? Give your faith. Comment or share. The years passed, but the fire did not go out. In many places in the world, communities inspired by the testimony of Francis began to emerge. They were not called movements, nor were they considered foundations. They were prayer groups, families, entire communities that consecrated their homes to the Immaculate Conception heart. Young people who prayed in the universities, farmers who offered his job daily, as a silent sacrifice. Each one from his corner responded to the message in a concrete way, not with speeches, but with life. And that, thought Matteo with frequency, was more powerful than any official document, because the gospel is not transmitted with power but with coherence, and Francis had shown with his death what many do not dare to live with life. On one of his last trips, Matthew was invited to the Holy Land. There, while I walked through the themselves paths that Jesus had trodden, he felt an unexpected clarity. He stopped in front of the Mount of Olives with the wooden cross in hands and understood something that would accompany you forever, that the third secret of Fatima was not a warning distant, but an urgent call to live his gospel with radicality. That it was not about fearing punishment, but about returning to the first love, of remembering that the human heart was created to burn, not to cool. And what if the church was a city today in ruins, still could rebuild, not with power, with prayer, with sacrifice, with Maria? That night, in Jerusalem, Matthew wrote a letter. He did not know if any day I would be read by many, but I felt that I should leave proof of what he had experienced. And she did not only recount the facts, but what there was understood, that Pope Francis' silence was not a resignation, but a language, that his last words were not a testament, but a sowing, and that the real secret of Fatima was not in symbols, but in each person's decision, in the face of the light. God has not stopped talking, he wrote, but we have stopped listening. If there is one thing we should recover, it is not the prophecy, but the ability to kneel. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed behind a stone next to the empty grave. It was his way of giving what he had lived through to the only one who could understand everything. When returned to his native Argentina, Matteo was received by a community simpler than it is I knew him since he was young. They decided stay, not because he was tired of the journey, but because he understood that the mission was not to move, but to stay. He settled in a small house next to a humble chapel, where every day prayed he rosary with who would like accompany him. He needed nothing more. There, in that secluded corner, continued ablaze his same fire. Sometimes they arrived youths with doubts, mothers with sick children, elderly people who just wanted to talk, and he listened, blessed, shared. He never spoke of the Pope as of a hero, but as a brother who knew how to see before others what was dying inside, and that, out of love, he decided to set the alarm before it was too late. With he passed of the overtime, the figure of Francis began to be remembered in different ways. For some, it was the Pope who dared to speak of the third secret. For others, the one that bothered with his simplicity. But for those who it knew closely, like Matthew, was he man who chose the truth above the convenience. He never sought impose an interpretation. He only wanted to open the eyes of the heart. And that intention, humble and firm, left a mark that no storm could erase. Because when someone acts from true love, even his silence becomes word, even its departure seed, even its cross, beacon. In every corner where someone I prayed again, where a family was reconciled, where a young recovered the faith, there was also his legacy. One day, an insistent journalist came to the chapel where Matteo lived. He wanted an exclusive interview. "You was the last person in, hear it, don't you?" he asked, expecting a sensational revelation. Matthew looked with compassion. "I had no intention to feed headlines." He offered tea, and with a calm smile, he replied, "I am not who it heard for the last time. I am one of those who still it go." On listening, the journalist, surprised, did not insist, but something in that phrase he played, because he understood that not everything should be reported as news. There are things the deepest ones that are only broadcast with presence. And the presence of Francis, even in his absence, still lived on, not in secret documents, not in museums, but in the silent decisions that each one made when his heart, at last, was burning again. Matteo refused always to write a book about what he experienced. He said he didn't want to convert his pain in anecdote, nor the faith in merchandise. I preferred to continue talking with who were really looking for, with who they arrived without cameras nor hidden intentions. His life is gone, becoming increasingly quieter but also brighter. Those who visited, they noticed something in his eyes, a peace that did not come from the comfort, but of certainty. That certainty that only they have, those who have touched the mystery with bare hands. It was not considered no wise man, no prophet, just a witness to what happens when someone decides to live as if the message already had been given, as if his sky, for more than a century, was expecting a single answer, the hour. With the years, they tried to reinterpret the message, that they wrapped it again in technical language, they locked up in documents, it complicated with new hypotheses. But Matthew remained firm. He said that essential was simpler than many wanted to admit. The Virgin did not come to give us fear, came to wake us up, he repeated. And whoever wakes up doesn't need understand everything. You just need get up and start walking. In one of his last public talks, in front of a group of seminarians, he asked for something unexpected, that they not be specialists in speeches, but witnesses of fire. The world does not need priests who explain everything to them. He said, he needs men and women who burn, and let them burn without fear. Nobody moved. Nobody. He applauded. There was only silence. The kind of silence that weighs nothing, the kind that transforms. Years later, in a letter sent from an African village where he was serving as a missionary, one of those seminarians wrote to Matteo, I don't know if I am good priest, but every morning I kneel and repeat what you taught us. Let it burn, Lord, let it burn. Matthew read those lines with the moist eyes. I didn't need recognition. Those words were more than enough, because they confirmed that the fire continued passing from hand to hand, from soul to soul, and that the most powerful revelation had not been what Francis said with words, but what caused with your silence, with his gaze, with his true choice. A pope who did not leave instructions but examples, who did not build monuments but roads. Sometimes, when falling in the afternoon, Matteo went out for a walk through the nearby fields. He stopped under the trees, breathed deep, and repeated in a low voice the rosary that so many times prayed with the Pope. He was not looking for visions or signs. I just wanted to stay faithful. In one of those walks, found a little girl sitting alone, looking at the sky. He sat down next to her and asked in that thought. She replied, I'm waiting for God to tell me something. Matteo smiled, gave the wooden cross he carried in his pocket, and him whispered, maybe already it did. Then he stood up and continued walking, leaving behind the image of a girl with a cross on the hands and the heart open. And he understood once again that the heaven does not need thunder to speak. A spark is enough the right place. One day, a group of pilgrims arrived at the small chapel where Matteo lived. They came from different countries, attracted not by religious tourism, but by an inner need. They had read about Francis, heard about his message of Fatima, and they wanted to understand more. Matthew them received with their usual warmth. They do not offered prepared speeches. They only showed the cross, them told about the last few days of the Pope, and them asked that we're going to do with what they had heard. A woman young, visibly moved, she replied, I'm going to stop waiting for the world to change. I'm going to change. And in that moment, it was done, a silence so deep that everyone understood that something had happened, begun to transform. Not outside, inside. That night, During the prayer, Matthew reread one of the underlined sentences in his diary he had written during his days with Francis. Lukewarmness is not a lack of faith, it is fear disguised. And he meditated on that for a long time. He understood that many Christians had not abandoned the church, but yes, had lost the fire. They followed attending Mass, but without soul. They prayed, but without hope. They lived, but without ardor. And he thought that was the great battle of this time, not against external enemies, but against the internal indifference. That is why Francis had spoken of the third secret with such urgency, not to provoke fear, but to awaken those who were walking asleep, to say, without shrillness, that the greatest tragedy is not the persecution, it is forgetting why we believe. With he passed of the over time, Matteo began to be seen by many as a kind of guardian of Francis' legacy, but he always corrected that idea. He said he wasn't a guardian of anything, just a wayfarer, that the legacy didn't need defenders, but imitators. The Pope didn't ask us to keep his words, he said. He asked us to live them, and that I was trying to do every day from the small. He visited the sick, blessed children. I listened to those who nobody I listened. He wasn't famous. He didn't go out in the media, but his presence had become a beacon for many, because where he was, it seemed turn on again the possibility of a living, concrete, incarnated faith. Not that faith of showcases, but the one that transforms life with everyday gestures. One afternoon, during an informal chat with a group of young people, one of them you asked if I thought they would come time worse for the church. Matthew he thought for a few seconds before answering, yes, but also stronger saints will come. That phrase spread quickly through social networks, although he never did it new. He became as a slogan for many who were fighting to maintain the faith in half of chaos, because he did not deny the difficulty, but claimed the hope. It was the same logic as Francis. Do not soften the true, but not either give in to discouragement. Because if the faith was attacked, more reason there was something to hug her with more force. And if the fire was going out in some, others, they had to burn twice as long. That was, after all, the answer that the darling had been waiting since 1917. In a letter that Matteo wrote before a surgery he underwent with a passage of the years, left a phrase that many preserved as a spiritual testament. It doesn't matter if you don't remember me, but remember that once there was a pope who wept for a church that was dying, and who decided speak before you die. That simple but powerful line was hand-copied into notebooks, painted on chapel walls, rural, printed in leaves hung behind altars, because it summarized it essential. It wasn't about him, nor even, if it was only Francis. It was about the urgency to wake up. If we do not continue postponing the fire, if not satisfied with the faith of Sundays, but with a surrender of all the days. After the surgery, Matteo recovered slowly. His body, I no longer had the same strength, but his voice remained firm. In the evenings, he sat in front of the chapel, reciting the rosary with the neighbors. Some, they came out of curiosity, others for consolation, but all stayed for something deeper. They felt that there, in that forgotten corner, something of God still was burning with strength. Once, a girl you asked if still could listen to God. He smiled and replied, God has never stopped talking. It's us, those of us who fill ourselves with noise. That phrase was repeated like an echo in the days following, because in a world saturated with voices, someone had remembered the power of silence. That same silence, in the one that Francis years ago had heard his real secret. One day, without warning or ceremony, Matthew left. They found in his armchair, with his rosary between the fingers and a serene expression on his face. There were no headlines. There were no tributes massive, but in dozens of communities, some in Africa, others in Asia, many in small forgotten villages, candles were lit, prayers were said, rosaries. They were offered masses, because those who they met, they knew that he had left a sour, someone who did not seek recognition, but that left fruits in every heart it touched. And together with his body, like a silent signal, remained the wooden cross that was there received so many years before. The one that had passed from hand to hand, lighting fires where before there was only ashes. In Rome, when the news arrived, some cardinals met in private. One of them, already retired, said in a low voice, he understood before many that the secret was not a document, but a call. Nobody. He replied, it wasn't necessary, because Matthew's legacy wasn't in great works, but in small fidelities. And in a corner from the Vatican, someone he placed a copy of the phrase that he repeated so often, the time of the signs, it's over. Now it's time for decision. It was handwritten on plain paper as a reminder that the message, it is still valid. It does not depend on popes or prophets. It depends on you, on me, on everyone. Because from Fatima until today, darling, go on doing the same question over and over again. Will you answer the call? The years followed its course, and with time, many they forgot the details. Not everyone remembered any more the name of Matthew, nor the faces of those who started that silent revolution, but the fire. He was still alive. He didn't need statues or commemorative dates. He lived in every soul that decided to pray rosary for love, in every sincere confession, in every family that was consecrated his home to the heart of Mary. He lived in the hidden, like a deep root that cannot be seen but sustains everything. And in some churches, especially the humblest ones, could still be read a sentence written on yellowish paper: don't wait for signs, be the answer. That phrase, without a recognized author, was the purest heritage of all that has been experienced. In a rural school, a teacher explained to her students the story of Fatima. Upon reaching the third secret, one of the children raised his hand and asked, "And what passed after it counted?" She smiled, went down the voice, and said, "It happened what happens when someone dares to say the truth. Some get angry, others wake up, and many, they begin to live differently." The boy said nothing more, but when he left class, he went directly to the chapel of the school and stayed over there in silence. Nobody you taught how to do it. He just felt that it should be there. And while the sun filtered through the window, it seemed that the darling smiled, because every time someone stops to really listen, the message finds a new home, one more, one different, one that may be the last or the first of many. With the passage of the years, many Vatican documents were declassified, and the third secret became a topic of debate again among theologians and historians. They organized symposia, were written theses, arose new theories. But in the midst of so much analysis, some voices simple followed, repeating what Francis had saying with clarity: the danger is not the end of the world. It is that the world continues without God. That phrase, which many intellectuals, they omitted it because they considered it not very technical. It was precisely the one that transformed the most hearts. Because I wasn't looking to explain, but to awaken. And in times of information overload, what was most needed was not just another piece of information, but a call to return. In a monastery of the southern Italy, a young monk used to write in his daily phrases heard in retreats or readings in books ancient. One day he wrote, "The truth is not always it makes noise. Sometimes it barely whispers, but if you stop, it changes you forever." That phrase wasn't his. He had heard from the mouth of an old man who visited his monastery toward years old, a man named Matteo, with a soft voice and a firm gaze. The young man didn't know much more. Only that visitor spoke little, but each word his left footprint. And he understood that the message of Fatima, far from being exhausted, continued growing like an echo that never fades. Because when the truth touches the soul, it is not needed repeated a lot. You only have to live it once, forever. In another part of the world, a young woman missionary, recently arrival in a region devastated by the violence, shared with the children a prayer that their grandmother there was taught. Mother of silence, teach us to listen. I didn't know that this phrase had also been one of Pope Francis's most repeated in his later years. But when he said it, something ignited in her interior. She felt that she was not alone, that mission so difficult that he undertook had deep roots, invisible but real. It was as if the message of Fatima, still without name will guide her, not with theories, with intuitions of the heart, with the certainty that the faith does not need explain everything to support everything. In the same community, a child you asked if God was still there talking. She answered without doubt, God has not stopped talking, we just have to learn to keep quiet. And in that moment, the child hid the eyes and joined hands. He said nothing, he asked for nothing, he just stood there in silence. And he understood that in that gesture had more faith than in 1,000 speeches, because the greatest secret, the one that neither you can't even write, is not in what is said, but in what one experiences when one lets oneself be touched by the true. And if there was something taught the story of Francis, Matteo, and all those who came afterward, it was precisely that the true miracle occurs when a soul surrenders in silence and listen. In the Gregorian University of Rome, years after, a teacher closed his class with an unusual reflection. He spoke about the third secret of Fatima, not from the eschatology nor from the mystery, but from the spiritual pedagogy. The greatest danger, he said, was not what it showed, the vision, but what it revealed about us ourselves. We get used to waiting for signs, when the gospel already, it said everything. The students, at first confused, began to take notes, not because a truth new, but because it was a forgotten truth. And when leaving from the classroom, one of them commented in a low voice, I think it's time to stop studying so much and start burning. That comment went viral among the students. Some began to gather in silence before class, just to pray. Others, they left social networks for a time, looking for more space to listen. It was not an organized movement, it was a response. A natural consequence of having understood that there is no greater secret than a faith lived with coherence. And without knowing it, each one of those young people became an echo of Francis, in fruit of Matthew, in witness of Mary. Because the true third secret, the one that no one could manipulate, it was that the heaven did not stop talking, that love continues calling, and that each generation has to decide whether he is going to continue sleeping or whether he is going to wake up. In a small hermitage in the north of Portugal, an old priest placed in a lit candle on the altar, and next to it, a handwritten note with the simple phrase, I will answer. It said no more. It was unsigned, but every time someone he would come in to pray, he would stop before that message. Some they cried, others knelt, and it wasn't because of the candle or the paper. It was because they understood that this word, so brief, implied an entire life. To respond is not to repeat, it is to deliver, it is to burn. And in that forgotten corner, what many they believed it had been a sealed secret, it was transformed every day in silent commitment. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, bishops and theologians followed suit, discussing about the official interpretation of the message of Fatima. But in the margins, in the spiritual peripheries, the simple people lived the message without debate it. They prayed the rosary, confessed, fasted, offered his pain for those who do not believe, and without knowing it, they complied with accuracy what the Virgin had asked for in 1917. They did not expect more apparitions. They did not ask for confirmations. They just responded, each in their own way, but all with the same fire. That fire that does not need explanations for existing. That fire that Francis, with his last strength, had tried to light once more before leaving. In a meeting with rural catechists, a woman raised the hand and asked shyly, "What if no one listen, the priest who was guiding the meeting?" He paused for a long moment before answering, "Then you will be the one listening, and that will suffice." Nobody applauded, nobody commented. But everyone understood, because sometimes the elderly, an act of faith is not speaking, but remaining faithful when the world has forgotten. And that faithfulness, silent but firm, was the same that Francis had lived until his last breath. He didn't need crowds. He only needed say what needed to be said, and trusted. That echo of confidence was taking shape in thousands of little ones' acts. A mother praying alone for her son, a young man who decides to confess after years, a community that recovers the habit of Rosario, a family that meets every night to offer He Day to Mary. None of them will come out in the news, but all of them, without know it, they are writing the end of the message, because the third secret was never a closed story. It was a warning, open, and its outcome, like the Gospel's same, will not be read in books, but in lives, transformed lives, ignited lives, lives that even without understand everything, they chose to respond. In the house where Matteo had lived his last years, a young woman found his ancient diary kept in a wooden box. I didn't have intention to read everything, just opened it out of curiosity. But as I flipped through it, the pages, a sentence jumped to the eyes. Do not fear the darkness of the world. Fear that your light will go out. He closed a notebook and stayed in silence. He didn't need anything else. That sentence was enough, and as he left the house, he went straight to your community and asked start a weekly worship night. I didn't know how to organize events. I had no experience, but I had it essential, a heart touched. And when a heart burns, it does not need permission to start lighting. That night, in that community small, something new began. There was no music. There were no sermons, just silence, an altar, and a few candles. But there, one by one, they began to arrive. Young people who didn't know how to pray, old people who years had not set foot in a church, mothers who came with her children asleep in arms, and each one, as he sat before the Blessed Sacrament, felt it same, that something was beating again, that not all was lost, that the darling still. I expected an answer, not a collective one, personal, intimate, non-transferable, and that, although nobody had said, was the strongest revelation of all. In the city of Lujan, a priest preached at an open-air mass when he suddenly interrupted his homily. He looked at the sky for a few seconds, breathed deep and said, "Maybe we are waiting for too big a sign," when the sign already arrived, and we didn't see her. Nobody understood entirely what he meant, but the silence that followed was more eloquent than any explanation. After the Mass, several people came up just to say, "Thank you for reminding us that there is still time." And at the end of the afternoon, when the candles were beginning to light up, it seemed that this square common had become a sanctuary invisible, where each soul had heard, somehow, an ancient voice calling back. In another part of the continent, a young man who had thought about leave, his seminar came across by chance with a letter written by Matteo, archived in a parish library. The letter spoke about persevering when fire seems to go out, about continuing to pray even if there is no consolation, about loving even when the world laughs at the faith. That night, the young he cried, not out of sadness but out of relief, because he understood that he was not alone, that others also had doubted, and even so had followed. And the next day, he returned to the seminary with a different smile, not because everything was clear, but because finally understood that the important thing was not to understand, but to remain. And that was, perhaps, the answer that the Virgin I asked from Fatima. No, that's it, understand everything, but don't leave. In a spiritual retreat, a woman shared his testimony. For years had lived far from the church, disillusioned by scandals, by indifference, by a feeling of abandonment, until one day heard talk of the Pope, who had dead whispering forgotten truths. I didn't know his history. I didn't understand anything about Fatima, but something in that image, an old man praying alone with a wooden cross in his hands, that broke inside. And from then on, every night, he prayed again. At first without desire, then with tears, and now with gratitude, because he understood that even those who walk away can return, that even the broken can be redeemed, that even in silence, God is still waiting. At a small Catholic publishing house, someone decided to print a little book with the last known phrases of Francis, not as doctrine, but as living memory, titled Before Leaving. The book was distributed without big campaigns, but it was passing from hand to hand, especially in small communities, and in every corner where it reached, it lit something. It was not because of the edition, nor by the name of the Pope in the lid. It was because the words contained, they were not looking their impress. They only remembered. They remembered that there was a time in which the darling spoke, and that a man, before dying, he dared to repeat it, and that, for many, was enough to start over. In a village in the Philippines, a group of children I learned to pray rosary for the first time. The teacher told them, he explained that each Hail Mary was like a flower for the Virgin, and that when many people were praying together, the sky was filled with garden. One of the children, curious, asked, "What if I pray alone?" She replied, "Then God will see a flower, and he will take care of it as the most beautiful of all." That child, that same afternoon, he sat alone next to a tree and began to pray in a low voice. No one it saw, nobody it interrupted, but in somewhere in the sky, someone smiled, because the message continued germinating, without noise, without hurry, without pause. And so, while the world kept turning, while new popes came and went, and while the temples were filled or emptied, one certainty remained like a flame that never goes out. Third Secret was no longer a mystery, it was a mission. It wasn't about knowing more, but about loving more, praying more, returning. And even though the human history continues writing with lights and shadows, every soul that says yes to the true, every heart that is given, every life that burns, becomes in part of the promised triumph of the Immaculate Heart. Because in the end, it didn't matter how much will be revealed or hidden. Essential always had been there, within reach of anyone I'd like listen to it. And the question, since 1917, continued resonating like an eternal whisper. Will you answer the call? Or will you continue waiting for a sign while the world silently moves away from the light? If this question continues resonating in your heart, don't ignore it. Share it. Echo it.